Our passage is in Matthew, our chapter 9, verse 9 through 13. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners."
Thanks, Amanda. Well, good morning. So glad that you're with us this Memorial Day weekend. And you guys came to church, man, on the holiday weekend. So you're just the real legends. You're awesome for being here. But my name is Jesse. I'm so glad you joined us. If you've never been here before, we're a new church in the city. We just got started in September. And we're just thrilled to be together. We're doing a series called IRL. And so many of our interactions that we have with people start off as one-dimensional as opposed to three-dimensional, right? Like so many of the ways we interact with people, maybe it's just via email, maybe it's via a phone call, maybe it's something like a podcast or just some interesting way where we're not interfacing with somebody like face-to-face 3D. We're interfacing with them through these other media channels, and then eventually sometimes those things go IRL. And it's funny because people can end up being different than you expect. Like I've had so many just experiences where I've been listening to a band even, or I've listened to a podcast, and then eventually you see a picture and the person looks nothing like what their voice made you expect. Right? You're like, oh my gosh, the lead singer of the band looks like that? Or one that's really funny is that you've been reading a whole book and you reach the end of the book and like you happen to open up that last page, that dust jacket, and you see a photo of the author and you're like, oh my gosh, I've been inside that person's mind for the last 200 pages. It really just absolutely shocks. Like, no wonder they didn't put it on the cover. Yeah, just kidding. But yeah, so it can sometimes defy our expectations. I actually heard about something called reverse catfishing. So there's catfishing, and that's where your online profile on Match.com or Hinge or whatever, Instagram, is actually like a fake picture. It's maybe been edited, or maybe you actually just stole somebody else's pictures and you're impersonating someone else. It's this gorgeous woman. It turns out it's like some guy named Al in a basement in Cincinnati. You're like, oh no, that's called being catfished. But there's something called reverse catfishing, and reverse catfishing is where you either by accident or intentionally post a really like kind of unflattering or weird or ugly photo of yourself so that when the person meets you in person, they're pleasantly surprised. They're like, ooh, this is much better than I hoped, much better than I expected. So that's reverse catfishing. And then there's something where maybe it's not anything you've done intentionally, but maybe somebody else has misrepresented you. Or maybe someone has been misrepresented to you. Has this ever happened where maybe somebody's like, oh yeah, this manager is a monster. You just wait till you hear this person from corporate and they're just bad-mouthing them. Or maybe they're like saying like, oh yeah, the boss told me to do this, per this person, per that person. It's like, why do you got to bring Latin into it? Per this, per that, and you're having this expectation of somebody being really negative, and then you meet them in real life. You're like, oh, it's actually a pretty like nice person, a pretty nice guy, and somebody has misrepresented them to you. Well, you may have certain ideas about God in your mind. There's lots of portrayals of Jesus that exist within culture. But the claim of this series, and ultimately the claim of the Gospels, is that when you encounter the real Christ, you're going to discover that he is infinitely better than you ever expected. That maybe regardless of what you've heard about him, that when you really see Jesus in the Gospels, he is absolutely tremendous. So that's the idea. And title this message, Jesus and the Crook. Jesus and the Crook. It'd be more commonly called like Jesus and the Tax Collector. And I'll explain why I'm calling him Jesus and the Crook. But the first thought I want to bring to your attention this morning is that grace is radical and shocking. Look with me at verse 9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. Now, when we think about, paying our taxes and the IRS, it's like not something we look forward to, but it was a whole different experience in ancient Israel because tax collectors, the Talmud and the Mishnah, these are rabbinical writings, they said that there was no figure more despised than a tax collector. The tax collectors belonged in the same category as robbers and murderers. Because the way Rome did things, and I mean, Rome basically was like an empire run by the mafia, okay? They even had like the Sicilian connection. Like the Roman Empire was like the mafia, basically. And what tax collectors were like, they would give the ability to collect taxes to the highest bidder, right? So you would pay Rome for the ability to pay taxes, and they would give you a certain amount that you had to collect in your district. But then anything you wanted to skim above and beyond that, you could. So you'd have like thugs, you'd have goons shaking people down. And they were particularly hated in Jewish society because Jews, right, they worship just the one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Moses. And then everybody else worshiped all these pagan deities. So here you are, you're siding with the pagans. You're siding with your oppressors. You're siding with the Romans. And then on top of that, you're greedy. You're money hungry. You're shaking people down. You're like a loan collector. When you picture Matthew the tax collector, you need to picture the Wolf of Wall Street, okay? This is like Leonardo DiCaprio. This is like corrupt. He's having wild parties. He's making all the money he can. He's robbing old ladies blind. Like this is what tax collectors were like. They were like mafia guys. They were like casino bosses. They were like loan sharks, or like the cash advance payday loan shop, like this is what tax collectors were like. They were sketchy dudes. And Jesus, actually in Matthew's gospel, because spoiler alert, Matthew ends up being the one writing this gospel. His whole world is flipped. I mean, he spent his life writing out ledgers of people's debts, but he ends up becoming the guy who's writing a gospel about the one who'd give his life as a ransom for many to pay everyone's debts. But Matthew's the one writing this, and he's already written how Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said to love your enemies. But here in this passage, Jesus does exactly that. He loves his enemy. He loves this traitor, this greedy person who's sided with the Romans and who's taking advantage of everyone and is money hungry. And he comes and loves this guy, and he invites him into his inner circle to leave his tax collecting behind and become one of the 12 apostles. Now, I kind of want to take a little moment and make this relevant to us. When you've really messed up, when you've really blown it, when you've gone against your conscience and you've done something wrong, I think for a lot of us, our tendency is that we want to run from God. We want to get away from God. We think, oh man, I need to create some distance. I need to avoid Jesus. Maybe like once I've gotten my life back together and I've kind of had a good streak, then I'll show up at church. Once I've had a good streak for a while. But I want you to know that when you are in your brokenness, when you are in your sin, when you're guilty, when you're full of shame, that is the exact moment that Jesus is moving toward you. He walks right up to that tax collector's booth and he says, hey, come follow me. I want you in my inner circle. And so you need to know that when you've messed up, when you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm so ashamed. I can't believe I did that again. I can't believe I fell again. That is the exact moment when Jesus wants to move toward you in grace. You see, grace is radical and it is shocking. So many people think that the message of the Bible is about trying to be a good person, trying to prove yourself, trying to be holier than thou, better than others, showing how righteous you are. But what we see here in big, bold letters in the Gospel of Matthew is that we are not saved by how moral and how righteous we are. We're saved by how gracious God is. And if you've been at Counterculture, you've heard me say this before, but I will say it over and over and over again. The message of the gospel is this, that we are not saved by our merit. We are saved by God's mercy. that acceptance with God, and that's what I mean by saved, acceptance with God is a gift that we receive. It's not something we achieve. That we are not accepted by God by proving how good we are. We are accepted by God by simply believing how good he is. That it's not about showing God all the things that we can do to be moral and be right and be perfect and be this impeccable resume. It's not about what we've done, but it's about what Jesus has done on our behalf. That's the message of the gospel, and that we are wholly loved, wholly accepted, wholly welcomed, completely brought in, simply as a gift of God's lavish, reckless, radical generosity. Now, this passage also mentions the Pharisees, and you may have heard this term thrown around, but the Pharisees were the most strict, elite sect of Judaism. Okay, they were the most hardcore, the most religious, the most absolute, like, we will not be contaminated by anything. The word Pharisee means separated ones. But in another one of the Gospels, in the biographies of Jesus, you could call them, the word gospel means good news, but the biographies of Jesus in Luke, it says this about the Pharisees. It says, they trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. And this is the picture a lot of people have of what it means to be a Christian, right? They trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. I mean, kind of like the classic example I think of is Angela on The Office, right? Just thinking you're better than everyone, looking down at everyone. But here we are in this account and in all throughout the New Testament, we're seeing this is the exact opposite. That Jesus' arch enemies were the Angelas. That Jesus' arch enemies were the Pharisees. That they were the ones always criticizing Jesus, always on his case, and ultimately the ones who conspire to have him murdered. They trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and they despised others. Maybe you've had a negative encounter with church. Maybe you've had a negative encounter with Christianity. Maybe you've had a negative encounter with religion. But the New Testament is a gigantic, flashing, blaring neon sign warning us that Christians can become Pharisees. That if we don't deliberately, intentionally remember the message of grace, we're in danger of becoming just like these Pharisees who are so disgusted that Jesus is hanging out with such bad people. One of the things before we move on to our next point that I want to bring to your attention is this. Maybe you're here today and you go, oh man, I can't relate with Matthew. I was never like the Wolf of Wall Street. I was never like a mob boss. I was just born in a Christian home. But I want you to realize no one was just born in a Christian home. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, it's a miracle that anyone was, first of all. Do you realize how bizarre it is that anybody worships a crucified Middle Eastern man? Like how bizarre that is, how unusual it is. It's just shocking and astonishing that anybody worships a crucified, poor rabbi from the first century. Like that is already wild enough. But even more than that, no one was just born into a Christian home. And what I mean is this. At some point in your family line, there was a Matthew. At some point in your family line, there was somebody who was lost and broken and degenerate and just felt, so far. And then they had this radical encounter with grace. And that's how your family came to start believing what you believe. For me, I've shared the story about my dad, that my dad was a hippie. He was doing acid and cocaine. He was actually homeless, sleeping under a porch. I think the same week that he came to Christ, he was actually sleeping underneath a porch. He came to Christ. His life was never the same. And so maybe we get dull and we get numb and we get, kind of inoculated to it, like, oh yeah, whatever, amazing grace. At some point in your history, somebody in your family was absolutely transformed. And it's just a matter of having that experience fresh and revitalized for you. And maybe you're here today and you go, well, nobody in my family is a Christian. Hey, well, you can be the first Matthew in your family. You can be the first one. All right, next thought is that Jesus brings a party. Verse 10. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him. And his disciples, when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and Pharisees?" It actually says that Jesus was reclining at the table. Like Jesus felt at home. Here he is with all of these like sketchy crooks and sinners. Other passages talk about how Jesus was hanging out with prostitutes. And here he is like kicking it with them. Do you realize Jesus was a party animal? He was, like he literally was. I don't know what perception you have of Jesus, but Jesus felt at home at a party. Jesus was the kind of guy people wanted to invite him to parties. I mean, I think some religious people who represent Jesus, like they don't get invited to too many parties. And people don't want them there. But Jesus, he somehow manages to be at home at a party. Look at Luke 7:34. I'll put it on the screen for you. The Son of Man, that's a title for the Messiah. It comes from the book of Daniel. It basically means the ultimate human and the king. But anyways, it says the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, here's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Jesus went to so many parties that his enemies were like, that guy's a drunk. That guy's just like a party animal. He's always feasting, always partying. And obviously Jesus wasn't, getting drunk to the point of like sin or whatever, but he fit in at a party. And if you have the idea that Christianity is this thing where it's like, if anything's fun, it's a sin. God's out to ruin your life, ruin your joy, ruin the good times, make your life dull and colorless and lifeless. Man, you got another thing coming, because this is not the Jesus of the Bible. The Jesus of the Bible, here he is, just kicking it, feasting, bringing a party. And by the way, even in the Hebrew scriptures, they should have known better, because the Hebrew scriptures picture of the kingdom is a feast with laughing and dancing, where there's wine running down the mountain. I mean, I can get on board with that. But it actually says that in the Old Testament, that when the kingdom of God comes, that wine is going to run down the mountains. It's like Aspen, in Dumb and Dumber. It's like where the beer flows like wine, or whatever. I don't even know. It's a great little quote there, But yeah, and that's why here at Counterculture, we want to be the kind of place where you could invite your friends who don't know Jesus, and they'd actually want to come. It's why we throw dinner parties. It's why we throw rooftop parties. By the way, it's coming up on June 6th. It's going to be dope. Like it's why we do art showcases. It's why we do these kinds of things, because I think that more accurately represents the kind of ministry that Jesus did. That Jesus was there eating and feasting with tax collectors. He was feasting and drinking with sinners and welcoming them into his presence. Now, obviously, there are things that God wants to change in our lives. And if you're like working on recovery, of course we want to be supportive of that. But I just want you to get this picture out of your mind that Jesus isn't this dull, stiffly Stifferson. That he's not like this boring square who's out to ruin your fun. This has been Becca and I's heart for Counterculture all along. Probably the verse that has been like my philosophy of ministry is this passage we're in today, but then also this one in Thessalonians. Paul says this about his ministry. He says, "We loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our very lives as well." Just eating with people, going out to coffee, going to dinner, having people in our apartment. And we want to create a movement of people who are like that. I read a study from Oxford University that was talking about how having meals with people is so good for your mental health. That just sitting at a dinner table, you actually eat healthier, because you're not going to just, scarf a whole thing of Velveeta when you have your friends over. You do that alone in the shameful moments of the night, But you eat healthier when you eat with other people. It actually is good for anxiety. It's good for depression. It's obviously good for loneliness, just eating, sharing meals with people. But here's what the Oxford University study showed. That 79% of people have never had a meal with their neighbor. And that more and more people are eating meals alone. So why do we do dinner parties? Why do we do rooftop parties? Why do we do all this? my hope is that you would invite your neighbors to have dinner, both at your apartment or your house in your neighborhood, but also at things that we do together as a church. We try to model that example in our own apartment complex, but I hope that we would be a movement of people who are following Jesus' example and feasting with others, because discipleship begins with friendship. Discipleship, that's the process of following Jesus, becoming more like Jesus, learning from Jesus, being a full-time student of Jesus. That's what discipleship means. But discipleship begins with friendship. The greatest single way to influence someone is to spend time with them. That is the greatest single way to influence someone. So, all right. So we said that grace is more radical and shocking than we might expect. And then we're saying now that that Jesus brings a party with him, and that our perceptions of Jesus being this square, dull, lifeless teacher is completely wrong and completely backwards from what the Bible teaches. And the next thought is this: when you truly know God, you love those who don't. When you truly know God, you will love those who don't. Verse 12, on hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." The misfits, the outcasts, the degenerates, the deviants, they've always been attracted to Jesus. And Jesus has always been attracted to them. To this very day, if you go, and I went to a recovery meeting not too long ago. You know what? They were all talking about faith. They were all talking about God. I mean, you go to so many of the houseless centers. You go to so many places. And these people who are in broken situations, they're attracted to Jesus. And Jesus is attracted to them. I was actually kind of trying to think of a real life example of a Matthew coming to Christ and becoming a follower of Christ. And I found this story, a true story. It was actually pretty astonishing. There's a mob boss named Michael Franzese. He was part of the Colombo family. And he was called the Prince of the Mob, all right? He lived in New York. And throughout the 70s and 80s, they had this racketeering scheme going on where they were, finding ways to make money off gasoline that was being imported. And he said that at one point he was making $8 million a week on this racketeering thing they had going on. He'd witnessed murders. He said that he'd actually put a gun into somebody's mouth before, threatening them, that he'd been a part of these horrific things. They called him the Prince of the Mob. But he got busted, ended up in prison, was there for a little while, did a stint, and then came out and then broke his parole and got thrown back in. And in 1991, when he was in solitary confinement, a guard slipped him a Bible into his solitary confinement, and he started reading the Bible. And he had this absolutely transformative experience with Jesus and with grace. And he's been on the straight and narrow for the past 30 years since then. And you can watch his testimony. You can watch how his absolute transformation happened. But this isn't even this isn't an isolated story. This is what Jesus does. There may be people who look at themselves and go, I don't need to be born again. I don't need all that church stuff. I went to the right schools. I'm a good person. I care about the right social causes. I vote the right way. I don't need that forgiveness. I don't need all that born again stuff. But you know what? The broken people, the down and out people, the people who are lost, the people who are sick, they are desperate for a doctor, and Jesus transforms. Now, I don't know if you ever heard about recidivism, but that's the amount of people who go to prison, convicts, who end up within 2 years ending up back in prison. And the U.S. has an incredibly high rate of this, up to 60%. Of people, they become repeat offenders, and there's so many issues with the justice system and so many factors that are part of this. But what I primarily want to share with you is that I think is really, really extraordinary, is that there has been study after study showing, I read one this week from Rutgers University, I read another one from the Center of Economic Policy Research, which says that if somebody has an experience with Christ and with faith and gets plugged into a church when they get out of prison, it exponentially decreases the likelihood of them being reincarcerated. And it raises the chances of them being able to live, a functional life, a life of transformation and redemption. The same thing goes with people with, substance issues. There is so much emphasis within the recovery community on faith and on reaching this place of brokenness and reaching this place of surrender and then having forgiveness and with 12 steps and with Celebrate Recovery and with all of these different things. But here the Pharisees, they're shocked and they're scandalized by Jesus. They're disgusted. But Jesus says, hey, I'm a doctor. Doctors exist for the sick. The Pharisees were so good at pointing out problems, but they had no interest in solution. They could diagnose the issue. Oh, that Pharisee or that tax collector, he's disgusting. He's not right. He's not, living according to God's law. But they had no interest or no ability of bringing a cure. They could bring a diagnosis, but they couldn't bring a cure. And there are a lot of people like that who are so able to point out problems, but have no interest in actually bringing solutions. Becca and I honestly kind of experienced this, and this passage, along with some of the other similar ones that I showed you, Jesus was called the friend of tax collectors and sinners. This passage was pivotal in why we started Counterculture and why we moved here. Because when we were in Albuquerque and we started talking about, we had lived in Portland previously, and when things were going on during 2020, and I realize all of these are complex issues, and I'm not trying to, say that every single thing, that happened wasn't, was great or anything. But as things were unfolding and all the headlines were filming Portland and all the news stories were coming out, we were having people approach us, very religious people, very, conservative people coming up to us and saying, oh, can you believe that disgusting city? I bet you're glad you don't live in Portland now. And it kind of made our blood boil. We thought to ourselves, isn't it the sick that need a physician? Didn't Jesus come for broken places? Like, if we're followers of Jesus, shouldn't we be running toward the issues and not running away from them and just criticizing from the sidelines, wagging our finger? And so it was actually this passage that made us feel just such a resolve to come back to Portland to say, you know what? Jesus loved us when we were sinners. Jesus loved me, Jesse Lusko. He loved us in our brokenness. And it's our responsibility to go and love others in whatever extent things are broken here. And so that's why we moved back to Portland, because we said we wanted to love Portland the way that Jesus loves us. Now, Jesus quotes from Hosea, and Hosea is an Old Testament book, a book in the Hebrew Bible, a Hebrew prophet. And in this period, there was horrific injustice going on, oppression of the poor, just awful injustice. But at the same time, they were being very religious. They were going through all their religious practices, going through all their sacrifices. And so in Hosea 6:6, God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. And the way I'd basically sum this up is this, and what Jesus is trying to say to the Pharisees, and I think what Jesus would say to a lot of, quote unquote Christians today, is that the evidence that you truly know God is that you love people. If you say you love God, you can be very religious, you can be showing up, but if you look down on people with contempt, and you look down on people like you're superior to them, and you see people as inferior, and you have no interest in helping people, then you don't really know the heart of God. You don't know the mercy of God. If your love for God doesn't produce love for people, then your love for God isn't real. Now, I like the way the New Living Translation puts verse 13. It says, I've not come to call those who think they are righteous. I've come to call those who know that they are sinners. And some of us can be prone to think, I don't really need this forgiveness stuff. I'm a pretty good person. I'm not too bad. There's nothing really wrong with me. Like I said, I went to the right schools. I do the right things. I care about the right social causes. I vote the right way. But I think the challenge that this passage presents to all of us is this. How do you treat people who've wronged you? How do you treat people that you think are wrong? Because that's the evidence of really, truly being a person of mercy, of really, truly being a person who's righteous. Anyone can be kind to their own kind. Anyone can be kind to the people they agree with. The real test of whether or not you're a person of peace is whether you can love people who are wrong. Matthew kind of serves as a challenge to anyone across the political spectrum, because Matthew was, on the one hand, living a very permissive, indulgent, unorthodox lifestyle, and so conservative people would hate him. But on the other hand, Matthew was in league with the oppressors. And so, in our culture, liberals would hate him. But here Jesus is loving him. And so the question that arises for us is are we going to be people who love our enemies? Jesus loved us when we were enemies, and that should enable us to love our enemies. Desmond Tutu put it like this. He said, Desmond Tutu was an Anglican priest in South Africa, helped dismantle apartheid. He said, if you want peace, you don't talk to your friends, you talk to your enemies. And this is exactly what Jesus enables us to do. This is where I think the gospel brings unique resources, because the gospel says that all of us are sick, that all of us are part of the breakdown of peace in the world, that all of us are part of the issue, but that Jesus loved us while we were sick, and that should enable us to love others when they are sick as well. When you pray with me? God, I pray right now for anyone who feels like a Matthew. Lord, I pray for anyone who feels like a sinner. They feel like just a complete mess up, a complete crook, Lord. And I pray that they would not avoid you, but they would run to you. They would realize that your extravagant grace is waiting for them, to welcome them with arms wide open. Lord, I pray for the Matthews in our neighborhoods, the Matthews in our city, Lord, that we would reach out to them, that we would extend ourselves to the people who don't know you, that we'd have dinners, that we'd have feasts, that we'd extend the invitation for people to come, Lord. And finally, I pray for those of us who sometimes feel superior to others, God, who feel like we don't need the doctor, we don't need grace, we're fine on our own. But we are really part of the problem in the world. We're part of the breakdown of peace through our attitudes of superiority and our attitudes of looking down on others, God. We pray that we'd humble ourselves and we'd come and receive your mercy, receive your grace, and be part of giving that mercy out to others. We're going to take communion now, and communion is just that weekly reminder that we're recipients of God's grace. We're recipients of Jesus' broken body, his blood. We're also going to have the prayer team available. We just always have the prayer team there because we're not meant to do this thing alone. We sometimes need a hug. We sometimes need someone to pray with us. And maybe you want to make the decision to follow Jesus, and you could talk to the prayer team about that. But let's sing together now.